So it's great to be here and great to celebrate Melina with her family and all of our Ph.D. graduates. I wanted to start with how I met Melina. I had known Melina for so long that I had to ask her, what was the first time we met? That's not because she's been in our Ph.D. program forever. She's been here as an undergraduate before she joined our Ph.D. program. And so I asked her last week, and the answer is a little bit unusual for the relationship between a Ph.D. student and their advisor, which is that Melina and I met at the Ingenue discotheque in Kampala in 2005. Now, again, that's not the typical way that people come into contact with a PhD advisor. I was in Kampala with a large research team carrying out a project on ethnic politics. Melina was an undergraduate doing an internship in HIV/AIDS in Jinja. And I don't know what Melina has shared with her fellow graduate students about my dancing abilities that night. But nonetheless, that first interaction has then blossomed into a relationship built around research that brought her into our PhD program and has led to a really productive and successful trajectory. And I'm so pleased about that, but I couldn't have known that that's how it was going to play out at the discotheque in Kampala. Now, there are 4 things I want to say about Melina tonight as a lens to help you understand both her research, but also Melina as a member of our research community. Things that inspire me, Melina, about your work and also your approach to doing your work. But I could go on and on. And in fact, when I sought some guidance from our department staff about how we would approach tonight and what we would say about our graduate students, I learned that there was a special rule for Melina, which was forget the 5-minute rule. You should speak for 10 or 15 minutes about Melina. And I think that's a measure of how much you are respected and appreciated in our broader community. Now, there are 4 things I want to say about you and your work tonight. The first is about the topics that you choose. From the get-go, Melina, you wanted to work on outcomes in the world that really matter to people. And you worked tirelessly to identify a puzzle that is powerful and important, and for which everyone, once they learn of the puzzle, wants to know the answer. Now, when Melina she graduated with human biology major here, came into our graduate program, she was coming into my office and the office of others, and she wanted to study health and education. And I kept asking her, health and education, you should be at the medical school, you should be at the education school. Where is the politics in what you want to study? And I was worried. I was worried about whether political science was a place for you. But Melina went hunting. She went hunting. She went looking around for a puzzle in the world that couldn't be understood without thinking about the politics that were at the core of it. And when Melina found that puzzle, she demonstrated that puzzle in powerful ways and hit us over the head with that puzzle over and over again. And what she did was she discovered a profound inequality in the world, but one that wasn't known or visible until Melina looked at the data and discovered it for us. And that's the following inequality, which is that compared to Christians, Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa have fewer years of education, are less likely to be literate in any language, and their children are less likely to be in school. That is, there's a huge gap across sub-Saharan Africa between how Muslims do in education and how Christians do in education. And Melina found this at first in one data set. And we sort of said to her, well, okay, it's there in that data set, but is this a more general relationship? And what she did in the same kind of data wrangling way that Jim was describing about Darren and could be described about Francisco and all of our extraordinary graduate students was she went and gained access to every data set she possibly could and showed us that that variation, that gap was there all over the continent, but it varied in important ways. That is, in some contexts, Muslims did far worse than Christians, and in other places, the relationship or the difference between the educational performance of Muslims and Christians was much less. That was a hugely important discovery in its own right. And Melina used her extraordinary statistical skills and data wrangling skills to demonstrate that puzzle for the very first time. And that raises hugely important questions that we as social scientists, but also people in the world want to understand, which is, number 1, where does that gap come from? And number 2, why does it persist in some places and not in others? And the question of persistence is incredibly important because in the period since independence in Africa, there have been huge investments made in education. education, not just by national governments, but by the international community that has mobilized billions of dollars to expand universal primary education around the continent. So the fact that Muslims still do significantly worse in some contexts is something that we wanted to understand. And there were some ideas out there in the literature that one might use to think about this question. Well, maybe it's something about Islam, about the religion of Islam, and the way that affects the demand for secular education. But Melina's framing of the puzzle almost ruled out that explanation by design because, of course, in some contexts, this gap was large, and in other places it wasn't. So naive explanations about the religion on its own weren't going to be the causal factor that would explain this variation. Maybe it was about missionaries. A lot of scholars were thinking about missionary education and the roles of missions in Christianizing populations and advancing secular education. But Melina wasn't satisfied with that as an explanation, and instead wanted to understand, well, why could missionaries really get a foothold in some places and not in others? That wasn't the start of the causal story. So the topics you choose are so important, and in your project, you have demonstrated for us meaningful and important variation that everyone who comes into context with your project wants to understand. But you were also so worried that you had identified this extraordinary variation, but you didn't have an explanation, right? And I can remember meetings when Melina had been to the field or was about to go to the field, and she came into my office and she said, I identified this really important puzzle in the world, but I don't know what explains this variation. Where would your explanation come from? And so the second thing that I so appreciate about you and your approach to research is your rootedness in the field. That you aren't content to study the politics of Africa from afar, to download data, to find correlations in the data set, and to draw conclusions on the basis of theory that you could generate from here. You believe, as I do, that learning about politics is something that you have to do by being in other places, by setting your feet on the ground, by immersing yourself, by developing relationships, by talking to people and engaging. And you, in the course of your research, which has been so far-reaching, have done that across the continent, from Nigeria to Ghana, from Uganda to Malawi. Most people go to one place. Anthropologists go to one place for 30 straight years. Melina went all across the continent in search of an answer to the puzzle of why Muslims do so much worse in some places than in others. And in doing so, she taught us extraordinarily important things about the nature of the religious marketplace and the demographics of religious groups and how they shape the political process. In a comparison of outcomes between northern Nigeria and Uganda, northern Nigeria, a place where Muslims have consistently done much worse over time. Uganda, a place where Muslims and Christians have performed much more comparatively and much more closely in terms of educational outcomes. She went deep into the archive. She did first-hand interviews. She gathered original data, both historical and more contemporary, to help us understand almost 50, 70 years of a trajectory of political development in these contexts to make sense of this variation in outcome. And taught us extraordinary things. Showed us how in Uganda, religious competition between Muslims and Christians, who were both sort of at the center of Ugandan politics in terms of their geography, led Muslims to self-organize schools to provide secular education so that their own kids could compete with the children of Christians in order to compete to participate in the new colonial state and in the post-colonial process. But that didn't happen in northern Nigeria. And it took your deep understanding of the pre-colonial period and the way in which colonial actors arrived in northern Nigeria to make sense of what it meant for northern Nigeria to be a place where Muslims were dominant, where Muslims were in control of political institutions, and because of that, there was no competition among religious groups for status, which meant that the colonial actors invested in the existing Islamic political hierarchy, and the incentives for developing an architecture for secular education didn't exist. That's the historical work that comes out of the kinds of comparisons that Melina generated. But not satisfied to only understand the history, Melina brought us all the way up to the present day to take a look at why it is that these gaps persist in some places and not in others. And there, not using historical and archival or qualitative comparisons, Melina used strategies of household surveys and data collection on the ground in Malawi to make sense of why, in this context, religious demographics continue to matter today. A place that has rolled out universal primary education across the country, where yet she still finds that Muslim majority areas in Malawi do much worse than areas where Muslims and Christians live alongside one another. And this exists even though Muslims now have equal access to schooling, or once you control for access to schooling. So why does that persist? And you had the most challenging project because you went into it with 5 or 6 explanations that everyone had thought about going in, about the role of religious elites, about access to schools, about the demand for education. And you developed an inventive research design to measure these things and found that none of the existing explanations could help you understand this puzzle. And that was yet another crisis, right? Here I've got variation I can't understand, but you went back into the field and you talked to people and you tried to make sense of what might be behind this relationship. And as with the first comparison, and as is typical of your work, you found your way to something that was inventive theoretically, which was original insights about how the Christian dominance of state institutions in societies may create incentives in Muslim majority areas for religious elites and families to keep their kids away from the school system or to underinvest in the provision of education. And the next challenge for your work is pulling all of this together and seeing how general that kind of explanation is, whether it helps us understand Malawi, but also more broadly. So these are 2 characteristic features of your research, but there were 2 other things I wanted to say as well that take us beyond your dissertation. The third is about how you think about social science in the world, which is you're someone who believes that social science can and should matter in the world outside of academia, not just in the literatures that we write for, but in the world that we actually inhabit. And that scholars have an obligation to use their skills and capabilities to improve people's lives. That's something that I hugely value about you. I know it's something that you share with me and something that has led, I think, to a close partnership between the 2 of us. You came to me early on, I think, inspired about the idea of field experiments, because you saw in the emerging use of field experiments in our discipline a sense that we had skills as social scientists that could help us shape what developing country governments and aid agencies are doing. And you were in search of a field experiment that could be the basis for your dissertation. And I waved my hands with warning signals saying, this is a high-risk strategy for you, Melina, as the core of your dissertation project. Field experiments are hard to pull off, they're exhausting, there are lots of late-night phone calls, lots of wrangling of government agencies and survey firms. I said, don't make this your dissertation. So what you did was just launch 2 field experiments on the margins of your dissertation, because you're so committed to the idea that social science should be directly relevant to the policy process and be generating insights that can shape what governments do, what NGOs do, what international organizations could do. And you're tackling absolutely critical questions that motivate those of us who care about Africa. Questions about democratic accountability, about the role of information provision in low education societies and how that shapes the vote choices that people make, about new technologies and the responsiveness of government. But your interest in social science and policy isn't just an interest that you practice through the craft of research, because little do people know that Melina has acted throughout her PhD program as a journalist at the local level when she's on the ground in Uganda, participating on radio talk shows and television talk shows, and lending insights that come from her scholarly and analytical perspective into the public debate in Uganda. And then the last thing I'd say that really stands out and continues to inspire me about Melina as a member of our community is that you recognize that the community that we have here is a gift, and it's a gift that sustains all of us. And you go above and beyond in investing your energies and talents in building community wherever you go. And I think everyone knows that in our department, and the leadership role that she's played in her cohort, but also more broadly at Stanford in the leadership role that she's played in African studies, where Melina is as active as anyone in engaging the anthropologists, the historians, the folks who study literature, and really thinking about how we can build a community that talks across disciplines when it's so easy to just talk inside our own disciplines. So Melina is off to NYU Abu Dhabi with Angelo and their beautiful daughter, and I wish you the best of luck and can't wait to see what comes out of your scholarly career and look forward to staying in close touch.